Henceforth Music on Black Power 96, and we just finished with T and Providence's Jazz Zone, and always a great spot. And we're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, and Dr. Horne holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies, and his research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has also written extensively about the film industry, and Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University and his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Princeton University. And his most current volume is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of American Fascism. And Dr. Horne, I have a question for you. September the 23rd was the birthdays of George Lester Jackson and John William Coltrane. Train was born in 26, George was born in 41, and it also was the day, the anniversary of when Bob Marley did his last live appearance in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He performed. He was diagnosed. He fell out, and he had to. They discovered that he had cancer. Could you talk about the significance of those three people?
Well, let me add number 4. We are marking the passing of Pharoah Sanders, who played with John Coltrane. It's striking to note that he either expired on the birthday of John Coltrane or shortly thereafter. In that regard, let me allow your audience to be the first to know that on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Saturdays, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, we usually have a music bottom underneath our interviews. Our music bottom this coming Saturday will be the music of Pharoah Sanders, who we have routinely exhibited his handiwork on our program. Likewise, we have routinely exhibited the handiwork of John Coltrane. For example, just yesterday, we exhibited Impressions, one of his more remarkable cuts. And with regard to George Jackson, I'll have more to say about George Jackson of Pasadena, California, more elaborately in this book that I'm now preparing that has gone quite rapidly. I may even begin to start to write it next year, that deals, among other things, with the Southern California Black Panther Party. And of course, Mr. Jackson, before he was slain in 1971, was a field marshal of the Panther Party. And we all recall that after he was slain under murky circumstances, it led to one of the more significant prison uprisings in the history of this country. Speaking of Attica in upstate New York in September 1971.
And before we really get started, I wanted to let you know that Ayuko Babu spent his last, was there at bedside when Pharoah passed away, and he had been with Pharoah, looking after Pharoah for maybe the last month. Ayuko Babu, the coordinator of the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles, and he is going to be talking to Carl Nelson sometime pretty soon.
Right on.
And Melinda, did you want to kick the show off? Well, you want to kick the questions off?
Yeah, I don't think we got to the Swedish elections. I don't know if you wanted to wrap that up or mention that.
Well, it's a part of a disturbing trend, the ultra-right wing coming to power. There are elections today in Italy as we speak, and we expect the ultra-right, the neo-fascists, the so-called Brothers of Italy, headed by Giorgia Meloni, a woman heading the Brothers of Italy, ironically enough. They will do quite well. And let me seize this opportunity to share with the audience a point that I find concerning. One should always be aware of those who share a position that's similar to yours. Now, that doesn't mean that you should ditch your position, but it should mean that you should sleep with one eye open and that you should cast a wary eye upon those with whom you share a trench. And in this regard, I'm referring to this upcoming coalition in Italy, which will probably include the 85-year-old Silvio Berlusconi, the man of Bunga Bunga fame, and you can ask Dr. Google what that means. And I mentioned Mr. Berlusconi because he's part of the right wing in Italy, and he's a reputed Trump-style billionaire. He's probably, as we speak, helping Moscow evade sanctions, although that's not a matter of public record. It's something that I'm speculating on based upon his previously close relationship with Moscow. And I fully believe that this new right-wing coalition in Italy, despite the fact that Madame Meloni has said that she's all on board with regard to Ukraine, sooner rather than later, I expect strains to emerge because Western Europe is going through a real crisis with regard to energy. The temperatures are beginning to shift already, and they had been dependent upon Russia for their energy, but then they decided to wage war on their energy provider, and now the taps have been. So I say to all of those who are, shall we say, skeptical about this escapade of U.S. and North Atlantic imperialism in Ukraine, to also keep a wary eye upon those who may also be skeptical, but as they say in Washington, do not necessarily share our values.
I have a question for you. Inside the United States, what is the progressive, and there would have to be some progressive Ukrainians inside the United States. I hope they are. What are they saying, or what are they doing, if anything?
That has not been a matter of public record. It may be because I haven't looked, but certainly in the mainstream press that I perused, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Houston Chronicle, Financial Times of London, Economist of London, and then the newspapers I scan online, including the Guardian of London, they don't say anything about progressive Ukrainians. Now, I haven't seen it in the left press either. I assume that some exists, but their presence has not been made evident. And let me add a footnote to my previous comment. With regard to the rise of the right in Sweden and Italy and elsewhere, it's a direct result of the North Atlantic countries waging a relentless war against class-based entities, not only socialists and communist parties, but also unions. And I think that prepared the ground for the rise of the antipode of these left-wing forces, speaking of these ultra-right-wing forces. And I'm afraid to say, too, that I'm not sure if the Black community in the United States is keeping up with this. And let me say, I listened to a lecture by Hugh White of Australia, who is a leading geopolitical strategist in Canberra. And he was talking about the new world that's developing with the rise of China and India. And he was counseling the ruling class of Australia that it could profit from this new world, but it might have to distance itself somewhat from US imperialism and try to cultivate better relations with China and particularly with India. Now, what's remarkable about the Black American community is that you can have a Cold War, a bipolar situation between Moscow and Washington. You can have the rise of a unipolar world with US imperialism in the saddle. You can have the rise of a multipolar world with the rise of China, India, etc. And these US Negroes, it's like nothing ever happened. I mean, they never adjust, they never adapt. And it seems to me that that's a maneuver or lack thereof that's leading us all over the cliff.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Had you concluded your comments, Dr. Horne?
Please continue.
I'll ask this question. I should have let Melinda ask it, but I'm going to jump in because it's about the U.S. Negroes in terms of the international question. It is my understanding that at one point it was Carlos Cooks who was the head of the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement, which took over from Marcus Garvey's organization. And Mr. Cooks, I am of two schools of thoughts with Mr. Cooks. I unite with a lot of things that what Carlos Cooks did. However, he was a staunch anti-communist. He was anti-Cuba, so on and so forth. And I never united with that. But apparently, in the beginning from many years, I think he might have started in the early 50s. They were supposed to have, whenever there was a UN General Assembly, Carlos Cooks would meet the leaders of the African countries, and I think he had a relationship with Sammy Njomo. Well, I know he had a relationship with Sammy Njomo of Namibia, former Southwest Africa. Could you talk about the UN General Assembly and your thoughts on Carlos Cooks when it came to the question of promoting internationalism among American Negroes or the tribe of Shabazz or so-called African Americans?
Well, what's striking about Carlos Cooks it's not only his presence in New York City, but his roots in Dominican Republic. And as I said in my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, the Dominican Republic has a very curious history. Of course, if you look at your map, you'll see that it's part of an island, a relatively small island that it shares with Haiti. And as I said in the book, in 1844, one of the first successes of U.S. covert action, the United States was able to engineer a split of the island to the point today where the Dominican Republic is trying to build a wall between Haiti and the Dominican Republic to keep out these darker skinned people. Because what's interesting is that from the inception, there was this color conflict with the Haitians perceived as being darker skinned than the Dominicans, which is not necessarily altogether accurate, but that was the perception. And that's the context from which Carlos Cooks emerges. And given that color context in the island we used to call Hispaniola, it does not necessarily surprise me that he tended to be, shall we say, obsessed with the question of color, question of what might be called Africanity, etc. Which brings us to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is a very important gathering every year. It's almost like a convention, a world convention, because world leaders gather there. many heads of state, if not foreign ministers. And that's when you can do a lot of business. For example, you can buttonhole a foreign minister you've been trying to catch up with. What I found remarkable about the speeches was that many of the African and Caribbean leaders seemed to be upset with this obsessive focus on Ukraine and then trying to twist their arms to join in the fracas, even though, as I might have said before, some of the same folks who are twisting their arms were saying during the Cold War, ending, you should believe, in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, or 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they said it was a mistake for African and Caribbean leaders to get involved in that, although I don't agree with that, but that's what they were told. But now they're being told to join the sanctions crusade. Many of them don't want to do so. Many of them wonder why not more focus on the crisis in the Horn of Africa with Somaliland undergoing famine and conflict, Ethiopia with the Tigrayans, or the conflict across the Red Sea involving Yemen, the Congolese crisis, sanctions against Zimbabwe, which a number of Southern African leaders mentioned, including the South African foreign minister. And I think what's happening once again is that the African and Caribbean leaders, they probably have been paying attention to what the thinking is in Canberra, Australia. That is to say, they know that we're facing a new international situation, a multipolar situation. There was a striking article in The Economist, the British-based weekly, conservative publication, that raised the specter of deindustrialization of Germany because of its lack of energy, which is startling. That's the fourth largest economy on planet Earth, which has made a fortune with its trade with China and its cheap energy from Russia, now facing the prospect of deindustrialization, if not a difficult winter where people freeze in the dark. And so African and Caribbean leaders, unlike some of our U.S. Negro friends, they're up to speed on this issue. They don't want to be boxed in with regard to Ukraine, but I wish that they would buttonhole some of our Black American, perhaps even Black Canadian leaders and organizations about this matter.
Let me say that before I turn it over to Melinda, that Carlos's Cook has one book out which was published by Tony Martin's publishing company, and it is going for $5,000 on eBay. Yes, I guess because Tony Martin is no longer in the land of the living, but that is, if you have a copy of Carlos Cook's volume, hold it close. And I'll turn it over to Melinda.
Yeah, so do we want to go over to Cambodia and the War Tribunal?
Yeah, I have to confess that Cambodia holds a special place in my heart. I arrived in that Southeast Asian nation approximately late 1979, believe it or not, with a delegation from the World Peace Council. This was shortly after the genocidal Khmer Rouge, which perpetuated genocide against its own people, were ousted by an invasion from neighboring Vietnam. And I was able to witness the aftermath of genocide, which, needless to say, was not very pretty. And for any who are interested in my papers at the Schomburg Center, New York Public Library in Harlem, on Malcolm X Boulevard, there's a profusion of evidence about what I saw and witnessed there. And then the delegation went on to Hanoi to meet with the leadership of the Vietnamese state and the Vietnamese Communist Party. And I'll never forget, this was during the time with difficult relations between Vietnam and China. And the Vietnamese leadership laid this tragedy in Cambodia at the doorstep of the Chinese Communist Party. They said that the Khmer Rouge were backed by China. Of course, after they were overthrown, China and the United States collaborated. You won't read about that in the papers today, or even in those articles about the ending of the war crimes tribunals. But China and the United States collaborated to punish Vietnam for overthrowing the Khmer Rouge. And the war crime tribunal just ended a few days ago with a remaining Khmer Rouge leader convicted. But it's something that's difficult for me to forget. And it's something, quite frankly, that our comrades and friends in Beijing are going to have to explain and perhaps even apologize for at some point.
And you are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96U. I assume you had finished your point, Dr. Horne.
Yes, sir.
You have another question, Melinda? Yes. Do we want to go over to Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Yes, so this is a conflict that's heated up lately. It's very complex geopolitically. Armenia builds itself as one of the first predominantly Christian nations. Your audience that skims Us Weekly or People magazine may recall it being the homeland of the Kardashians. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi was just in Armenia, accompanied by two Armenian American congresspersons, Ann Eshoo and Jackie Speier. California has a sizable Armenian American population, including the former governor, George Deukmejian, and the well-known late writer, William Saroyan. So what's striking is that when Nancy Pelosi shows up in a country, that tips the hand as to who imperialism is backing. But what's curious is that Armenia is also backed by Russia. Azerbaijan, actually, I have to confess, it's another country I visited back in the day when it was part of the Soviet Union, is part of the Turkic-speaking community. It's oftentimes suggested that Azerbaijan and Turkey are two states and one people. So the Turks are supporting the Azeris. So it's very complicated because, as we've said before on this program, Washington has had it up to its keister with President Erdogan and the Turks, because they feel that the Turks are too busy playing footsie with the Russians, even though the Turks have supplied drones to Ukrainians that have inflicted substantial damage on the Russian military. So I'm not sure how this Azeri-Armenian conflict is going to work itself out, but the geopolitical tensions are apparent.
And you're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and this is the last question. Dr. Horne, you wanted to talk about Delroy Lindo. Delroy Lindo used to live in Toronto, Canada, and the last time I saw Delroy Lindo in the flesh, he was looking to see Dion Brand, and I was on Bathurst Street, which is a street that you have been on many times when you come to Toronto. But Delroy Lindo, I remember I walked him down to Dion Brand's place, and I never saw him again until I went to see the movie the Spike Lee joint Malcolm X, and there Delroy was playing a West Indian archer. That was, and I guess he's getting a lot of acclaim now. Could you talk about Mr. Lindo?
Well, I only mentioned him because I happened to catch the TV series that he's been doing on CBS. Of course, I saw it on disc. I'm still old school to that degree. Entitled The Good Fight. It takes place in contemporary Chicago. He plays the head of this overwhelmingly black law firm that makes a small fortune suing Chicago over police brutality cases. And of course, that's real. I'm sure you know about Benjamin Crump, the black lawyer who's become a multimillionaire by taking on his clients, Trayvon Martin's estate, George Floyd's estate, etc. But the twist in this series is that what happens is there's a Euro-American woman who we oftentimes crosses swords with, who defends Cook County and defends Chicago when Delroy Lindo's firm sues. And what happens, for reasons I won't go into, she goes bankrupt and becomes a pariah amongst the Euro-American elite in Chicago. So she joins Delroy Lindo's firm. And so what's interesting is that it's an interesting race class tension when you have these Euro-Americans working under the supervision of Black Americans, which, if we don't tip into fascism, I dare say will be the wave of the future, except that the Black American supervisors will probably be, in a best case scenario, administrators of state-owned enterprises under the aegis and auspices of these socialist United States of America. Now, of course, that sounds outrageous, and it may not happen in my lifetime, perhaps not even in yours, unless you find the fountain of youth. And of course, billionaires are searching for that as we speak. So hang on, you might be able to take a pill that will allow you to live forever. But in any case, the series, The Good Fight, is interesting. And Delroy Lindo, I've been watching his acting, and he uses his hands quite a bit to convey his moods, his thoughts, his sentiments. He's a very good actor, and you can tell.
But he uses his hands. That sounds like you.
Well, you can tell from that tick that he has extensive experience on stage, which leads me to this question. Did you ever see him on stage?
No, I did not see him on stage. No. He used to live with a cool of people of Cool Benjamin and Derry Mead. He walked off. They said he walked off, and again, they never saw him again until they went to the Spike Lee joint and saw him playing West Indian Archie. And I think his famous scene, he was asking, I think Denzel was asking Delroy, like, what's your angle? You know, yeah, what's your angle?
If it's Denzel, you're talking about the Malcolm X movie then.
That's what I thought. I didn't say Malcolm X. Yeah, the Malcolm X movie, right.
Right, I see. Right on.
And this is the last thing I wanted to say. Did they mention Standish Willis? Standish Willis is a lawyer from one of your comrades from. He was a lawyer from Chicago. Did they have anybody representing him, because he was the chief leader against the whole question of police. One of the chief leaders against police brutality in Chicago, wasn't he? As well as a supporter of the Cuban Revolution.
Well, this is fiction. It's a dramatization, so perhaps they draw from his life experiences, but his name is not mentioned.
I got you. I understand.
Right.
Yeah, but he was a great lawyer in. Didn't you meet him in Cuba?
Well, no, we were. When I was doing law, we were part of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and used to cross paths quite frequently, although I haven't seen him in years.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add, sir?
Well, let's see. I'm headed to Los Angeles in a month or so, ending my lockdown since the spring of 2020. Very excited to be getting back to the archives, because The well is almost exhausted and will be exhausted after I finish writing this book about Washington, D.C. So it's time to get back to work. And I have to say, I'm excited to do so.
Anything you'd like to add, Melinda Francis?
No, I guess we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
All right. Take care.